secularism no more enjoys the hegemony it once had as a desirable political value that nation states shall aspire for. In different parts of the world, champions of religious majoritarianism have successfully established their regimes not necessarily by sabotaging the existing liberal secular political frameworks, but largely working within them. Increasingly, the idea of temporary majorities that is core to the working of liberal democracies is getting replaced with relatively permanent religious ethnic majorities that can capture power very much under the procedural framework of liberal democracy, but by harming it in substance. This new development places a new challenge before the discipline of comparative secularism to comprehend, explain, and theorize it. This talk will be tracing the academic endeavors in such a direction and will examine what lessons does contemporary Indian situation offer and attempt to understand religious majoritarianism from a comparative secular framework. Now, I request Dr. Rekha Nair, convener of the program and head of the Department of Political Science, to deliver the welcome note.
Good afternoon, all. Respected Dr. Needu Ma'am, IQC Coordinator, distinguished resource person, Mr. Sharath Shashikumar, distinguished participants, dear colleagues and students. This is really a prestigious moment for the Department of Political Science to organize a national webinar as a part of Alhaj PK Kunyasahib Memorial Webinar Series 2021 in collaboration with IQAC MSM College Kayangulam. Our founder Alhaj P.K. Kunyasahib strongly believed that any investment in education sector is an investment for future generation. Considering the socio-economic educational backwardness of the area, he initiated and founded a network of institutions at Kayangulam, which was the realization of his long cherished goals. This webinar series is also a tribute and honor to our respected founder. I am now moving to the my official duty. I take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to our manager, Alhaj Hilal Babu sir, for giving us enormous support in conducting such webinars. And I also express my sincere thanks to our principal, Dr. Geeta Kumari ma'am, in absentia, giving us support to conduct this program. And also express our sincere thanks to Dr. Amina ma'am, Education Secretary, MSM Group of Institutions, for giving us encouragement and support. And I also express my thanks to Dr. Muhammad Taha sir for giving us support. And now I welcome our IQC coordinator, Dr. Needu ma'am. She's giving us enormous support and constant encouragement in conducting such webinars behind all the academic activities of our college. And I express a sincere welcome to Needu ma'am to this webinar. And I also welcome our distinguished resource person, Mr. Sharath Shashikumar, research fellow, Center for Policy Studies, JNU, New Delhi. And he's talking about already there is a description regarding the topic is already given. He's talking about comparative secularism and religious majoritarianism, lessons from contemporary India. The topic itself is relevant in this context of celebrating the 74th Independence Day. We are eagerly waiting for the excellent presentation. I welcome Dr. Sharath Shashikumar to this webinar. And I also welcome distinguished participants and teachers from various colleges. I extend a very warm welcome to all the distinguished participants. And I also welcome my colleagues, Adil teacher, Anas sir, Jayaprakash sir, behind all the effort done regarding the webinar. I also welcome the faculties and students of my colleges and various colleges in Kerala and outside Kerala. And also a, a warm welcome to the technical support given by the technical organizers in our college. And I also welcome all the participants, students. I once again welcome one and all. And I hope this webinar will be a grand success and will enrich your knowledge also. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I request Dr. Neetu Sundareshan, IQAC coordinator, to felicitate the program.
Good afternoon, one and all here. First of all, I will say sorry that I cannot switch on my video because I have some bandwidth issues at my end. So good afternoon, one and all. Respected head of the department, Rekha teacher, our chief guest of the day, Sarath Sashi Kumar sir, our student IQC coordinator, Anas sir, Advaita teacher, Jayaprakash sir, and participants who have joined this meeting from various colleges, distinguished faculty members, research scholars, and my dear peers. I'm so happy to be with you this day. And this is, in fact, a proud moment for me in my life that whenever we initiated for this PK Kunju Sahib Memorial Webinar Series, Political Science Department was the one come who have come up with a series of webinars, international as well as national, that they have on hold to organize various programs under this banner. And I should say frankly that political science department is one of the energetic department of our college. They always make their presence feel by organizing one or the other programs every time. And they keep the students motivated, activated, and I do enjoy their programs all the time. And I'm so happy to have Sarath Sasikumar sir with us. He has been with us quite some time before to deliver a talk on, sorry, I don't know, just a minute, deliver a talk with student IQAC, Citizen Amendment Act. That was what he talked that day. And that day we had a very fine interaction. I enjoyed thorough interaction with the students, and they too enjoyed on the other end. And you are all fortunate to have him right now. And I hope that all of you will have a meaningful interaction in the coming time. And another request I want to make to Political Science Department at this point of time is, as national education policy has been implemented, I request you all to organize one webinar on that, so that our teachers and students should know what is in store for us in NEP 2020. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak here. I'm so proud of you. All the best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I call upon Ms. Afiha to introduce our resource person.
We live and die by our communication successes and failures. So it is with special excitement that I am pleased to welcome Sharath Sasikumar to our national webinar. He is currently pursuing a PhD on the topic Marxist Political Praxis and Dalit Identity in Kerala at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He was also awarded MPhil from the same center in 2018 for his work on caste question and parliamentary communists in Kerala, emergent issues, trends and transformations. Some of his academic contributions and published works mainly focus on topics related to Marxism, social movements, politics of education, working of Indian constitution, etc. He was graduated from Sri Kerala Varma College, Thrissur in 2012 and had completed his Masters in Political Science from the University of Hyderabad in 2014. Today, in a world where secularism no more enjoys the hegemony it once had as a desirable political value, Sharath sir would share his ideas on the topic Comparative Secularism and Religious Majoritarianism Lessons from Contemporary India. Sharath sir, I cordially welcome you to this session in order to demystify this vulnerable topic.
Hello all. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. So good afternoon all. So as it was already mentioned by the organizers, today we are discussing the topic comparative secularism and religious majoritarianism. And regarding this broader topic, what we can learn from the contemporary Indian experience. So first of all, we need to understand what is the broader historical background in which we are discussing this topic and trying to uh, understand and theorize this phenomenon called religious majoritarianism and how it is posing new challenges to the ideal of secularism. So, our contemporary period, when we look all around the world, is characterized by a global right-wing upsurge. So, right-wing regimes, which extreme right-wing policies are in power in different parts of the world, and our part of the world is also not an exception. So, increasingly, right-wing mobilizations, which is also called right-wing populism, based on populist notions of politics and based on xenophobic kind of mobilizations, are gaining roots all over the world. So this is a historical context where secularism, like many other political ideals, are becoming more and more unfashionable. If we look beyond some half a century ago, when the decolonization process was happening and many new independent nations were emerging in the world scene, ideals like liberal democracy, secularism, or even to an extent socialism was being considered as the necessary ideals which the newborn nation states shall follow. The newborn nation state shall aspire to be secular, aspire to be welfare states, aspire to be liberal democracies, aspire to be socialist, etc. But in the contemporary period, these political ideals have become unfashionable, and it is certainly related to the key features of this global right-wing upsurge that has been happening all around the world. So if we examine what are the key features of this global right-wing upsurge that we are experiencing and are having direct implications on the ideal of secularism also, the first and foremost thing is of the debunking of the welfare state. Welfare state is no more a fashionable concept in this under these regimes, and neoliberal policies are pursued in a vehement manner. As a result of this, there is a increased insecurity of the people. When there is no more a mighty state to support you, to take care of you, to prioritize your welfare, then naturally the citizens or the people in these who are living in these new regimes are becoming increasingly insecure, and these economic, psychological, and cultural insecurities are addressed by these right-wing leaders who are in power in or moving towards power in different parts of the world by projecting and winning. For example, suppose an economy is facing too much problems and is the system is not able to cope up with these problems, then instead of addressing that problem immediately, the right-wing populist leaders actually point out to an enemy and say that, look, these are the sections or these are the people who are taking away your jobs, taking away your livelihood, making you more insecure. These are the people who are behind the terrorist attacks that are happening in your country, and so on and so forth. So this is a pattern that is observable all around the world in contemporary times. And essentially, all these right-wing regimes which we are talking about, and I will come to its implications on the ideal of secularism, like how this global right-wing upsurge is having an implication on the ideal of secularism. But before that, to point out the key features of this upsurge, one among that is that the celebration of emotions or wild passions of people are legitimized, and there we can see an increasing tendency to delegitimize rational thinking. So in these times of Corona, it is or COVID-19, it is more obvious and it is easily observable how these right-wing regimes in different parts of the world are debunking rational thinking, delegitimizing scientific resistance, and trying to appease to the superstitions and wild passions of people. For example, in our own country, if we look how the regime that is there in India, the NDA government has been dealing with the Corona crisis, it is not difficult to see that many unscientific or pseudo-scientific practices are being endorsed, encouraged, and even given political patronage openly by those who are in the power. For example, the Ayush Ministry in India was trying to prove, or still trying to prove, that the objects which are considered sacred according to traditional Hindu practices, like the water from the Ganges or the cow dung, all these objects are effective in resisting the virus. So our Ayush Ministry is spending crores of rupees to establish that these objects which are considered as sacred, these objects which are considered as having supernatural qualities, they actually possess the qualities to resist this virus. So instead of scientifically investigating a remedy for the virus spread, the already those objects which are already considered as sacred or valuable or supposed to be having supernatural beliefs, all the scientific machinery is used to establish its scientific value. So it is against all norms of scientific thinking and scientific inquiry, and also scientific resistance to such pandemics. So this is another feature of this global right-wing upsurge. And most importantly, the most important feature of this global right-wing upsurge is that these right-wing movements, which more or less operate within the framework of liberal democracy, sabotage one of the very key concepts which is crucial for the working of liberal democracy. See, our liberal democracies work on the principle of temporary majority. That is, on the basis of the political debates, that are happening in a political system at a certain point of time, people move to democratic elections. And in those democratic elections, on the basis of the political issues that are being discussed in that election, people form a temporary majority and give mandate to a particular party to rule. So this majority formed through elections is supposed to be temporary. That means when new political issues arise, when new political issues come to the political scene, people again discuss these issues. There will be changes in public opinion, and people may opt other parties to lead them, to rule them for next 5 years or whatever the term is. So this idea of temporary majorities are very crucial to the working of liberal democracies. But all around the world now, these right-wing populist movements are trying to establish a relatively permanent majority. It may be on the basis of race, it may be on the basis of religion, it may be on the basis of linguistic identity, or on the basis of national or subnational feelings. These right-wing populist movements try to establish a relatively permanent majority. So it becomes quite easy to capture power by forming a majority. So instead of debating on political issues, instead of putting your manifesto to the people and encouraging a rational debate on that, you simply appeal to identities, say for example, Hindu and Muslim. So if you divide people on the basis of this religious identity, Hindu and Muslim, in societies like India, or especially in India, it becomes quite easy to exploit this ethnic majority or religious majority to exploit this majority for your political ambitions. And that means you convert this religious majority into a democratic majority. So in practice, procedurally, all the procedures of liberal democracies are being followed, but in substance, it becomes no more a liberal democracy, but a majoritarian state with theological or theocratic overtones, a Hindu majoritarian theocratic state. So, these are the key features of this global right-wing upsurge which we are talking about. And now let's examine how this is having an implication on the ideal of secularism. So first of all, for secularism to thrive upon, there should be some sense of fraternity among the people. That means people should leave behind their primordial identities in their private sphere and come to the public sphere as citizens or as individual citizens, and they should have a sense of fraternity among them while they're interacting and making decisions. So the idea of secularism itself is that in public policy making, instead of you looking onto a holy book, or instead of you considering the other world, you taking into account the otherworldly considerations or religious considerations, you make rational decisions on the basis of this worldly considerations. So the very meaning of the word secular, if we go to its etymological roots, is this worldly. So the very idea of secularism is that let us separate the public sphere and private sphere. So in private sphere, you can have your own religious convictions. In private sphere, you may believe in a particular religion. You may take your decisions on the basis of your religious convictions. But when coming to the public sphere, the public policy making, should be on the basis of rational debates and this worldly considerations or secular considerations. This is a very idea of secularism. But with this global upsurge of the right wing, people increasingly rely upon not only on religion but also on religious and other primordial affinities and get mobilized on that basis. So the very basis of secularism, or the very basis on which we operate this separation of church and the state, or religion and the state, is increasingly under threat. Also, as I had pointed out, as rational decision making becomes unfashionable. Can you switch off the microphone? Okay. So when rational decision making becomes unfashionable and people increasingly think on religious lines, on religious consideration, and even interfere in politics or intervene in politics on the basis of religious considerations, and the animosities between religious groups are openly encouraged for political benefits, then this very idea of people coming together, having rational debates and taking political decisions on the basis of these rational debates, the whole process of secularism becomes inoperative. So this is the threat that we are facing all over the world now regarding secularism. And this is the crux of this new phenomenon called majoritarianism threatening the secular ideal. And coming to the case of India, first of all, it needs to be clear in our minds that these days we have a regime that is not only uncommitted to the ideal of secularism, but very much committed to the idea of dismantling secularism. I repeat, the regime that we have now in India, its ideological leanings, its ideological foundation is clear that they are not only uncommitted to the idea of secularism, but they are committed to the idea of dismantling secularism. So this generates from, or this takes shape from their idea of nationalism itself. So during our freedom movement, during our anti-colonial independence movement, if we examine, there were two kinds of national concept. That is, once India became independent, how our nation should be envisaged. There were vigorous debates on that. So the mainstream of our national movement was following the idea of an inclusive territorial nation. That means whatever may be your race, whatever may be your religion, whatever may be your linguistic identity, if you are residing within the territories of India, you belong to the Indian nation. So this was a inclusive kind of nationalism that had been followed by the mainstream of the national movement. But the Hindu nationalists at that time, who were not in the mainstream of the freedom movement at that point of time, but who are in the mainstream of our contemporary politics, they were of the view that this notion of nationalism is absurd. So their idea was that religion is important for formation of a nation. So, for example, the second Sarsang Chalak of Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, M.S. Golwalkar, in his 1939 book, We or Our Nationhood Defined, says that actually that book itself is a critique of this idea of territorial nationalism. So he says that people who reside in a particular territory cannot constitute a nation just like that. Instead, there should be at least 5 unities for a nation. And he says that one is geographical unity, second is racial unity, third is religious unity, fourth is cultural unity, and fifth is linguistic unity. So, instead of a heterogeneous pluralistic nation, they had been envisaging a monolithic kind of nationalism where you have geographical unity, racial unity, religious unity, cultural unity, and linguistic unity. So, according to this idea, the very notion of secularism that we had been following is considered to be a Western concept. It is alien to India and Indian ethos. So, the regime that we have in our country right now operates on the basis of these ideological foundations, or these are the foundations of their ideology or their thought world. So what they want to do now is that, as I mentioned earlier, there is an attempt to redefine democracy. An attempt to redefine democracy as the rule of the majority. Democracy is, of course, the rule of the majority. The very idea of democracy is that you go to the people and conduct democratic elections, and based on majority, you form the government, and the legitimacy of that government essentially derives from the fact that you enjoy majority in the electorate, directly or indirectly, either directly from the electorate or through their representatives, like in parliament. So if you have majority in parliament, you are the legitimate party to rule that country. This is the idea of democracy. But this majority, as I mentioned earlier, is supposed to be temporary majority based on political debates and discourses. But there is an attempt to redefine this and replace it by the concept of an ethnic majority. So there is an attempt to draw a direct correlation between rule by an ethnic majority and democracy. So the Sangh Parivar, which now the Sangh Parivar means the RSS and its Parivar organizations, including the ruling party, Bharatiya Janata Party. So their idea is that true democratic rule stands for the rule of the religious or ethnic majority in India, that is the Hindu. So the notion of all-encompassing self-rule representing all Indians, or an inclusive self-rule representing all Indians, is reinterpreted to say that democracy actually means a Hindu ethnic majoritarianism. So they say that democracy in any other form is not a real democracy but a sham. So this attempt is being made in our country to redefine democracy and constitute a majoritarian rule, and give political patronage to religious majoritarianism and make it the order of the day. So this is the experience through which we are passing through. Now, why we should discuss this? That is the crucial question. Okay, majoritarianism is in rise in our country. A particular religion is being favored over other religions. Secular ideals are being increasingly delegitimized or being given up by the political elite. But why, as students of social science or students of political science, we should discuss this. Why we should spend our time to understand this phenomenon which is happening in our country. What is the significance of these enquiries, including this talk we are conducting, including this discussion we are conducting on majoritarianism and secularism? What is the significance of that? So, first of all, I think we need to understand that the character of the republic in which we are living is changing. So, as you all know, as a culmination of our freedom movement, our movement for national independence and freedom from colonial subjugation, as a culmination of this, a republic was formed in 1950 in India, and it constituted a secular, liberal, modern democracy with a spirit of inclusive nationalism. So the character of this republic is changing, and we are increasingly moving from a secular democracy to a ethnic majoritarian theocracy. So if this Hindutva upsurge or right-wing Hindutva right-wing upsurge goes unchecked, soon our republic may change its character, and our republic will be an ethnic majoritarian theocracy. That means a section of the population who are identified as Hindus, the true inheritors of the land, or people belonging to the particular so-called national religion, will be favored, and others will be relegated to the status of second-class citizens. So this is going to have an impact on our political system, an impact on our lives. So it's very significant to understand this phenomenon, theorize it, and make it a part of our knowledge. As political scientists, we are trying to understand our political system, its nature, the phenomenon happening in the political system, etc. So this is very significant in the sense the very nature of our political system, the very nature of our state, the very nature of our republic is going to change. So that is the first point that comes to mind when we think about the relevance or significance of our attempts to discuss this majoritarianism. So as we have, as it was mentioned in the introduction, last time when I talked to the students of MSM College was in the same platform, I think, or similar platform. What we discussed was Citizen Amendment Act that came into existence last year. So what does it actually aim? It actually aims to exclude some sections of our population on the basis of religion from citizenship. So if this trend of Hindutva right-wing upsurge goes on unchecked, as I mentioned, large sections of the population may get relegated to the status of second-class citizens, but it won't stop there. They won't be just relegated to the status of second-class citizens, but many of them may even be expelled from the citizen roles that is being enthusiastically prepared, like the National Register of Citizens. So, in the preparation of National Register of Citizens or National Population Register and all, this religious criteria is carefully inserted, and the result will be that many people who belong to the non-Hindu category, according to the Sangh Parivar, they may even get expelled from the citizen rolls, citizen list, or register of citizens, as they call it. Another effect of this majoritarianism would be that the right to freedom of conscience and choice of religion that we enjoy under the present constitution may get replaced with a forced obligation to adhere to Hindu confessionalism. So according to our present constitution, freedom of conscience is guaranteed. There is a freedom to choose your religion. You can freely profess, practice and propagate your religion, whatever it may be. And you are not binding to follow one particular religion. But if this majoritarianism goes unchecked, and if this majoritarian project succeeds, then that freedom would be taken away from you, and you will be bound to adhere to some form of Hindu confessionalism, some form of Hindu religion, which is being propagated by, or as you know, whether there is a religion called Hinduism or whether Hinduism comes under the category of religion itself is a debatable matter. But anyway, what the Sangh Parivar believes is that there is a monolithic religion called the Hindu religion, and once a majoritarian regime is established, once a theocratic regime is established, your freedom to choose religion will be taken away, and you will be bound to follow Hindu confessionalism. And another implication of this majoritarian absurd would be that the modern liberal ideas which we are cherishing, like liberty, equality, and fraternity, and which are enshrined in our constitution, and which many subaltern sections in our society use to claim liberty, claim equality, claim fraternity, etc. These ideals will be repudiated, and instead of that, pre-modern hierarchies may enjoy state patronage in the name of tradition. So this is very obvious in many cases. For example, the Shabarimala women-centric case that we discussed very much in Kerala. So in a nutshell, that case was that women in our society who are traditionally subjugated, who are according to traditional hierarchies a subaltern section, they actually make use of these modern ideals like liberty, equality, and fraternity, especially the ideal of equality, to say that, look, according to our constitution, we are equals, and so we cannot be discriminated. But the Hindutva response to this was that whatever may be the modern notion of equality, the tradition says that women can be discriminated, and traditionally women are supposed to perform some gender roles and remain subjugated to men. So this right to practice traditional rituals need to be protected. So this will become a norm. So made beyond the question of caste, made beyond the question of gender, instead of attempting to have some kind of equality, there will be an attempt to glorify these traditions and traditional hierarchies in the society. So these are some of the implications of this majoritarian absurd that is happening in India. So we have discussed the larger global background in which we are discussing this topic of majoritarianism in India, and we saw what will be the implications of majoritarianism in our lives. And before winding up this presentation, let us have a brief look on what will be the major challenges to this Hindutva majoritarianism. Hindutva majoritarianism is of course on the rise, and they are now having some kind of hegemony in our society and in politics. But if we are thinking about what will check their movement, what will tackle their this upsurge. Then some of the possibilities that I see is that one is, of course, the existence of the secular constitution and its relatively rigid nature. Our constitution is not that easily amendable. Especially there is a concept of basic structure of the constitution. So our larger consensus is that secularism comes under the basic structure of the constitution, and this cannot be amended just by obtaining political majority. So at least the Hindutva forces will have to pass through a rigorous constitutional rigorous constitutional procedures to move towards the establishment of a system that they are aspiring for. And second is, of course, related to that, the existence of an independent judiciary. But unfortunately, that is being increasingly questioned nowadays, or increasingly under question nowadays, that we doubt that whether the judiciary is independent enough, because there are constraints of time. I'm not going into detail on that issue, but as there is still a notion of independent judiciary, let us expect that it will also continue to act as an obstacle. And another important factor that may work as an obstacle in this Hindutva majoritarian, against this Hindutva majoritarian upsurge, is the assertions by the subaltern castes within the so-called Hindu community that problematize the notion of a monolithic Hindu community. And of course, the active presence of secularists in the civil society, the modern character of our educational system, all these still act as obstacles before this onward march of Hindutva. But they are trying to remove these obstacles in a systematic manner. For example, when there is active presence of secularists in the civil society, those people who act as active presence of secularism, active presence of or active champions of secularism in the civil society are either getting imprisoned or getting killed in broad daylight. Like we know about the murders of Gauri Lankesh, Narendra Dabholkar, Govind Pansare, and other cases. And even in the case of the modern character of the education system, the new education policy that has been brought now makes an attempt to saffronize education to its core. So all these are attempts by these forces to remove these obstacles one by one and establish, as I mentioned, a Hindu majoritarian theocratic rule. So this is the larger picture when we look into India to learn some lessons for comparative secularism and to understand what is happening in India in this interplay between secularism and religious majoritarianism. So I am stopping here, and I think we can discuss more of secularism, religious majoritarianism, and its interplay in different political systems when we move to the discussion session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The floor is open for discussion. The participants can unmute themselves to ask questions or post their questions in the comment box.
Yeah, good afternoon. Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am. Carry on.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I've kind of listened to the discussion from 2:45 onwards. I was a little late. But from what I gathered, I think it was a brilliant presentation. Thank you, sir. I'm Dr. Madhuri, Associate Professor, Delhi University. My question basically is, when you were talking about the challenges to the current times and to the current setup that we have. Was it a conscious decision to overlook the interrelationship between minorities vis-a-vis majoritarianism? For instance, I'll give you an example. When the triple talaq judgment was passed, that time there were 5 judges on the bench, if I remember correctly. And there were 2 judges, Chief Justice Kehar and one more judge, who said that triple talaq, who spoke against the judgment that triple talaq should not be tampered with. Let it prevail as it is. But there were 3 judges who wanted the triple talaq to go, the system as it prevails. Now, here also you find that one was a Sardarji, Justice Kehar, and the other judge was a Christian. So I'm talking about their view as far as the Muslim community is concerned. So this point is very valid, the interrelationship between minorities vis-a-vis majoritarianism that is concerned today. Second, a quick one. What is your kind of message for the academic community, for students, for teachers, let's say for the intellectual class? How can we kind of, the current state of affairs, is there any alternative? We have a very populist, majoritarian kind of a government today that we cannot deny. Any message that you have, how we can, kind of deal with the current times? Yeah, thanks, Sitan.
Okay, I think I shall answer that question. So, regarding the minorities, it was not a conscious decision to avoid speaking about the interplay between majorities and minorities. But what I broadly want to suggest is that maybe we are in a time where there is an urgent need to go beyond these notions of majority and minority. Whenever our debates on secularism has been largely centered on this idea of a majority community, some minority communities, their interplay, how majority will be affected, how minority will be affected and all. But may it be in the case of triple talaq, or may it be in the case of gender discrimination in Hinduism, like in the Shabarimala case, or may it be in the case of caste discrimination, etc. There is an increasing amount of assertions from these subaltern communities or subaltern sections within these religious communities to reclaim these constitutional values, or to make use of these constitutional values like that of equality. So their point is that once there is a modern constitution before you which promises equality, that equality should be available to all. So these community barriers shall not be shall not act as barriers, or community shall not act as barriers in getting justice for this section. So the very, especially in the Shabarimala case, if we look, there was a clear movement from the idea of essential practices test to the idea of gender equality. So the essential practices test was that when something related to religious community comes before the judiciary, for example, a ritual of a particular religious community comes before the judiciary, what the judiciary used to look is that whether that ritual, whether that practice consists of an essential religious practice of that community. And if it was an essential practice of that community, the judiciary won't interfere in that. But now, thanks to the increasing feminist assertions in the society, its impact is visible in judiciary also, so that may it be majority community or minority community, the practices which goes against the notion of equality shall be outlawed. Especially the separate judgment delivered by D.Y. Chandrachud in the Sabarimala verdict of 2018 was clear that just as we have outlawed untouchability, just as untouchability based on caste is outlawed by our constitution, discriminations on the basis of gender can also be considered as untouchability by giving it a wider definition. So more than the majority-minority discourse, I think now the question is the feasibility of using constitution as an instrument for social transformation, for modernizing and democratizing the society. And in that process of modernizing and democratizing the society, the very idea of giving legal recognition to the communities, giving legal recognition to the idea of religious communities is being put under question, or it is becoming increasingly irrelevant in the jurisprudence. That is what I think regarding that. And regarding the alternative to this majoritarian populist upsurge, the only alternative I see is people's movements based on concrete economic issues. As I mentioned in the beginning, these right-wing upsurges have an economic dimension. They are increasingly manifestations of the insecurity people are facing, insecurity people are experiencing due to the neoliberal policies and the debunking of the welfare state. So there is an urgent need to mobilize people and educate them that, look, the insecurities you are facing, the hardships you are facing are not the result of conspiracy by some other sections of the society. It's not because Muslims are taking away your jobs, or the blacks are taking away your jobs, or the immigrants are taking away your jobs, or the refugees are taking away your jobs. It is not about some other section coming and taking away your livelihood, so that you should hate them. Your political mobilization should be in opposition to them. Your political decision shall be in opposition to them. We as people need to really come out of this framework and address the problem in its entirety and demand state to provide basic welfare, demand state to provide basic education, basic health care, demand the state to strengthen the labor laws, demand the state to give subsidies to the farmers. Like that, on day-to-day livelihood issues, there should be mature political mobilization that will make people conscious of their rights, their right to have welfare policies, instead of and on the basis of that, rejecting this idea of some certain sections spoiling your livelihood and promoting the rivalry between different religious identities. Thank you.
Sir, there are some questions in the comment box.
Okay.
You can select and answer.
So there is a question, please mention about pseudo-secularism. The term pseudo-secularism does not have much relevance in any serious discussion about secularism. That's my opinion. Pseudo-secularism was actually a construct by the right-wing Hindutva forces to delegitimize the secular project in India by saying that it's all about favoring the minorities and it does not give anything to the majorities or is actually harmful to the majority community, and secularism means all about protecting the minorities. But for any project of secularism, it is essential to protect the minority rights in the sense that those people who do not adhere to the majoritarian norms, majoritarian religious norms, majoritarian religious practices, majoritarian religious political agendas, there should be a right for them to dissent, or a right for them to lead a different kind of life. But if that way of life or that way of religious practice of the minorities also, as I mentioned in the answer to the last question, if that minority religion or minority religious practices also become an embodiment in the administration of justice to all sections of the population, that also need to be resolved constitutionally. So that means in the name of group rights, you cannot prevent different oppressed sections within the religious communities like women or lower castes. In the name of traditions or in the name of community practices, you cannot prevent them from having their due share of justice. So this is the complex situation where we need to balance minority rights and the rights of the different subaltern sections within minority religious communities or even majority religious communities. Other than all these notions about pseudo-secularism, secularism means all these allegations of secularism being minority appeasement and all are quite absurd, and it's all part of the political propaganda that the Sangh Parivar has been peddling to construct a sense of Hindu victimhood among the people. Other than that, I don't feel that it have any relevance in any serious discussion about secularism. And there is another question, is secularism necessary for a good governance? If you mean by good governance, improvement of lives of all sections of people, then of course secularism is necessary. Otherwise, as I mentioned, in a system of majoritarian theocratic rule, a large section of the population will be considered as second-class citizens without any substantial rights for them. So, by governance, if we mean the welfare of all, if good governance is all about providing welfare to all sections of population impartially, then of course secularism is necessary for a good governance.
Sharath, there is a question from Nitin.
Okay. So there is a question. Can you switch off? Okay. There is a question from Nitin Vijak. How do you see the resistance mobilizations based on identity against right-wing majoritarian upsurge? Even besides the resistance, how do you see in relation to secularism, deprived communities articulating themselves politically? So what I think is that as far as the resistance mobilizations based on identity like caste and religion, as far as it debunked the majoritarian notion of a monolithic Hindu community, to that extent it is progressive. There is a progressive potential in those assertions when they come forward and assert that, look, there is no monolithic Hindu community as you are boasting about, and we are different, and our problems are different, and our concerns are different. Of course, that brings into our mainstream discourse their lived experiences, their special concerns as historically disadvantaged and depressed sections and oppressed classes. So, to that extent, their identity assertions has a progressive content, and they need to be furthered. That progressive content need to be furthered. But if that stick to that and leads to entrenchment of these identities instead of formation of a modern sense of fraternity and fragmentation of society into other forms of identity and political hostility based on these identities, then it may again hamper the secular project, I think. For example, as I mentioned, the notion of communities itself is being increasingly questioned as part of secularization of the society. So, for example, if there is a resistance movement based on religion, or an attempts to establish a theocratic society, but at the same time, in the name of community autonomy, if that movement is blind to the internal churning that is happening within their religious community, may that be of women or may that be of some lower sections within their religious community, or even the class question within their community, if they remain blind to those and just end up in entrenching these identities as something sacred, then it is just like replacing the Hindutva identity with some other kind of identity, and that will essentially hamper the secular project, and it's and may hamper the emancipatory potential of the secularization project. That's what I think. So there is an increasing need to move beyond our focus on the politicization of these communities. Politicization of these communities or political articulation of these communities have been discussed much. But what we need to discuss now is that these communities itself are political in the sense that they are power ridden. They are not power free collectives. They are power ridden within themselves. So while taking into account their political articulation, we need, as I mentioned, we need to differentiate between the progressive aspects of such political articulations of the communities and the inherent limitations in community-based political articulations. But more importantly, there is a need to acknowledge that these communities may be on the basis of caste or may be on the basis of religion. They themselves are political in the wider sense of the term, that they are power ridden. So there may be, or there are subaltern sections within those communities. So a modernization project that is getting unfolded in India will have to take into consideration this fact also, and may have to finally dismantle these communities to move towards a greater sense of fraternity or greater sense of universal brotherhood. Are there any further questions from the audience?
There are few questions in the comment box, sir.
Okay, I can see one more question from Nidin. That is, how central is majoritarianism to the very idea of nationalism? Is secularism only trying to resolve an inherent defect of nationalism, the forced homogenization, by introducing an idea of public sphere or universality? So, what I think is that we need to move beyond the concept of a homogeneous idea of nationalism. Nationalism at different historical junctures can play different roles. It can be defensive at sometimes, it can be aggressive at sometimes, it can be inclusive at times, it can be exclusive at times. So even in the case of Indian nationalism, there are scholars like Perry Anderson who think that Indian national movement was never secular. It always had a majoritarian tone, and he says that Indian secularism is just another name for Hindu confessionalism. So their argument is that whether it be in the constitution or whether it be in the legacy of the freedom movement, Hindu majoritarianism was the order of the day, and there is no point in basing ourselves upon either the constitution or the legacy of the national movement to fight for secularism, as they were never secular. But I think that as I mentioned, that we need to differentiate between different forms of nationalism. Nationalism is not a homogeneous category. So even though within the idea of nationalism, even during the anti-colonial independence movement, there were majoritarian tendencies which tried to impose certain religious practices or even certain language over other languages and all. Such majoritarian tendencies were there, and there were attempts to appeal to Hindu sensibilities to make political mobilization easy. But in spite of all these deviations, the secular idea of inclusive nationalism, of accommodating everyone who resides within the territory of a newly formed nation, is completely different from that of an exclusive kind of cultural nationalism, which presupposes the existence of a homogeneous monolithic culture, and which says that those who fall outside that category of homogeneous monolithic culture are foreigners, are mlechas, are to be treated as outsiders, and they cannot be loyal to the nation. These two, when we compare, are completely different ideas. Both the territorial nationalism represented by the mainstream of our national movement and the Hindu nationalist vision about nationalism, both belong to the category of nationalism, and there are two ways of envisaging nationalism. But if we fall into the trap of saying that both are same and both essentially have majoritarian overtones, then I think that may not explain the situation correctly. So I think this differentiation is very much important, and I think especially considering the majoritarian upsurge that has been taking place in our country, we need to focus more on this difference between an inclusive secular nationalism on the one hand and a majoritarian exclusivist nationalism represented by the Sangh Parivar on the other hand.
Sharath, Sharath, How do you look at populism? Is populism always associated with right-wing forces?
No, like populism as a concept has been used differently in different circumstances. So there is no clear definition of what constitutes populism, but generally the key features of populism are described as